The fine North Carolina writer Reynolds Price went through an excruciating cancer years ago that left him without the use of his legs. Soon after, he wrote a moving account of his cancer called A Whole New Life. Several years beyond that, a young man diagnosed with cancer himself happened to pick up a copy of Price's book, read it straight through in one sitting, and then wrote Price a letter asking what might be the most urgent question of all. He wrote, "I need to know, does God exist and does God care?" And then his letter went on, "I want to believe in a God who cares because I may meet him sooner than I expected. I think I'm at the point where I can accept the existence of a God, otherwise I can't explain the origin of the universe, but I can't yet believe that he cares for us." Does God exist? And does God care? Is there a God we can depend on in a world where so many things seem to go terribly wrong? It's a question that I suspect everyone ends up asking at some point along the way, and some wrestle with it all their lives. I imagine nearly every priest has to stand in front of a church and gaze into the numb, uncomprehending faces of parents who've lost their infant child, or of the family of a young man dead in a car accident, or of the children and husband of a remarkable mother in her 50s who's finally lost the long fight with breast cancer. My guess is that just about every one of us has known what it means to sit on the mourner's bench and try to make sense of terrible loss. Where is God in this tragedy? How could God let this happen? But the questions get harder. What can people of faith make of terrible events in which thousands perish? Sometimes it's a natural disaster, such as a tsunami that swept through the Indian Ocean some years ago, killing 300,000 people. Or the tornadoes that have been upending houses and lives in the South in recent weeks. And human disasters can be even worse. What do we make of the 10 million lives that perished under Stalin, or the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust? And who can keep from asking, where is God? As we watch on our televisions the bombings in Syria and follow the reports of desperate refugees drowning in their futile quest to get to a new life. In Elie Wiesel's book, Night, which is an autobiographical account of his experience as a boy in the Auschwitz concentration camps, we see a group of prisoners gathered around to watch two men and a boy being hung at once. For half an hour, the three struggle between life and death, and as they struggle, the young Wiesel hears a man in the crowd ask, "Where is God? Where is he?" How do we reconcile all this with belief in a loving God? For many atheists, the reality of suffering and evil was the deal breaker for their faith. Evil isn't a problem for an atheist worldview. If you believe in a meaningless, uncaring universe, you really have no problem. But for Christians, the challenge is real. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume summarized the issue this way: is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is God able to prevent evil but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is God both able and willing? Then why do we have evil? No answer coming forth. Of course, there have always been simplistic answers to why suffering happens. Sometimes you can hear a person speak with confidence that this tragedy must be God's will if God is all-powerful, as if God chooses to torment his children. Sometimes you hear that God causes suffering to teach a lesson. There are hard passages in the Bible about God sending plagues and famines to punish the people of Israel. In fact, in one psalm, the speaker asks, "Has God forgotten to be gracious?" The book of Job in the Old Testament presents an unyielding rejection, though, of the notion that bad things happen to bad people and good things to good people. Job is a virtuous man in every way, and every possible thing that can go wrong for him does. The loss of his family, his property, his health. His friends come to console him and try to figure out what he must have done wrong to bring this on himself, but he insists that he's a good man. So he demands that God explain. After 40 chapters of some of the world's greatest poetry, he never gets an explanation, but instead catches a glimpse of an immense, mysterious God who will never abandon him. Jesus' friends in our gospel today don't understand why there is evil either. Some Galileans had been protesting, and the government officials had tracked them down and murdered them in the temple. And soon after that, a tower under construction in the old wall around Jerusalem collapsed, killing 18 workers. The workers were killed by a natural disaster, like the victims of earthquakes and tsunamis. Were they evil, these workers? There's no correlation, Jesus says. And as he says on another occasion, God makes the sun to shine on the good and the bad, his rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Bad things happen to good and bad people both. So Jesus turns the question on its head. It's not a question about who deserves and who doesn't deserve what comes their way. It's a question finally of our relationship with God. Turn to God, Jesus is saying to his disciples. Learn to trust God through good times and bad. That's finally what matters. I don't believe there is any way of holding together faith in a loving God and the suffering we see in this world without holding on to Christ's cross. We're taught to think of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, as the supreme ruler of the universe in charge of everything. But Christians believe that the one full revelation of God we have ever had was in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In him, we didn't see an all-powerful ruler making things happen. We saw one who was pure, unbounded love, who didn't command and impose, but who called and invited and forgave and healed and confronted and encouraged. We Christians believe that God is Christ-like. God is love. And love means not controlling, not micromanaging the world. God holds the world, embraces it, and works within it to draw human beings into the communities of love and goodness for which they were made. God chose not to create a world of puppets under divine control, but to create free creatures in a world that operates by its own laws and patterns. That freedom grants our world, that freedom God grants to our world allows there to be such things as earthquakes and also beautiful sunsets. It allows there to be brilliant athletes and physically challenged children. It's a world where there are stunning brain cells doing amazing things, and there are cancer cells killing people. It makes possible a Mahatma Gandhi and an Osama bin Laden. In fact, the best analogy I know for God's way in our world is that of a parent. As much as they might wish to control their children at times, parents cannot ultimately control what their children do or become. They love their children, they teach them, support them when they fail, and confront them when they must. But at the end of the day, if the parents love them, they have to give their children freedom. It's a risk to let your child walk to school alone for the first time, or ride a bike for the first time, or go off to college. And parents can't prevent the car accidents or calamities in college or bad choices as adults that our children can so easily make. To love is to risk, to let go, and then to be vulnerable to pain when the one we love suffers. God is like that. As the theologian Douglas John Hall put it, God's problem is not that God is not able to do certain things. God's problem is that God loves. Love complicates the life of God as it complicates every other life. Love means letting go and bearing the pain of what comes from the freedom our children are given. The earliest Christians became convinced that when Jesus hung up on that cross outside Jerusalem, God was hanging there too. The cross is God's declaration that when we suffer, God goes through the anguish with us, that when evil comes, God will bring healing and new life out of the worst that can happen. I know what you're going through, God says. I know what it's costing. I've been there, but I'm going through it with you, and I promise you there's more life ahead. Where is God? That angry prisoner cried again in Auschwitz as the crowd continued to watch their friends hanging on the gallows. And this time, Wiesel says, I heard a voice with me answering him. Where is he? Here he is. Here he is, hanging here on the gallows. On the cross, God is united with us in our worst agony and loss. William Sloane Coffin, who was chaplain at Yale at Riverside Church in New York for many years, had to endure the death of his college-age son. Young Alex had been drinking and on the way home ran through a barrier and plunged into a river outside Manhattan. The night after he died, a woman made the comment to Coffin, I just don't understand the will of God. And the fiery Coffin let loose with the pent-up passion of a grieving father. I'll say you don't understand, lady. Do you think it was the will of God that Alex never fixed the lousy windshield wiper of his? That he was probably driving too fast? That he probably had a couple of Frosties too many? That there were no street lights and guardrail on the road? And in the sermon he preached the next day for his son, the one thing that should never be said when someone dies is, it's the will of God. Never do we know enough to say that. My own consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God that Alex die, that when the waves closed over the sinking car, God's heart was the first of all hearts to break. Today we're not given any explanation or justification of human suffering. Instead, we are given Christ's body broken for us, his blood shed for us. Turn to the God who can make all your suffering and confusion bearable, Jesus is saying. Respond in love to the victims of the world's calamities. Hold fast to the God who is holding fast to you. That's God's answer to the worst we face. No formulas, no clarity, no theories, just Jesus giving us his life, drawing us into God's life, and promising that nothing can ever separate us from that love.